So welcome, everyone. So this panel will build on the previous discussions of evolving dynamics in the South China Sea to focus on how security relationships are developing between and among U.S. allies in the region. My name is Kristi Govella, and I'm Senior Advisor and Japan Chair here at CSIS. So obviously we know that the South China Sea is critically important to the economic and security interests of other countries who do not have territorial claims in the area. And moreover, what happens in the South China Sea doesn't stay in the South China Sea. Instead, it sets precedences that have consequences for developments in other areas around the world. So as we've already talked about earlier today, we've seen increasing cooperation among U.S. allies in response to the changing dynamics in the South China Sea. And we're joined today by 4 speakers who will share their expertise on Japan, the Philippines, and Australia, and the ways that these countries are engaging with each other and with other regional actors. So we have today Tetsuo Kotani, who is Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and Professor of Global Studies at Maritime University, Dianne Despi, who is PhD candidate at the University of Delaware, John Blaxland, who is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at Australian National University and Director of the ANU North American Liaison Office, and Kathryn Paik, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Australia Chair here at CSIS. So we'll go ahead and start with Tetsuo Kotani, please.
Thanks, Kristi, and thanks to CSIS for having me this year. This is my, I think, 5th or 6th participation in this conference, and I was here 2 years ago on the same topic on the evolving the partnership networks, and I remember I emphasized the importance of the Philippines in that context. So I will provide a kind of a follow-up observations on how Japan has expanded its partnership with the Philippines and beyond. So in short, I think the Philippines has become our equal partner for Japan from recipient of the capacity building assistance over the past 2 years. We have conducted a 2+2 meeting between Japan and the Philippines, and we have conducted lots of combined exercises and trainings based on the 2+2 agreements. And also we just concluded the reciprocal access agreements so that the 2 militaries can visit each other more easily. And the Philippines became, the Philippines is still a capacity building assistance partner, and the Philippines became the first recipient of the Japan's new initiative called Official Security Assistance, which provides military equipment to the foreign military organizations. And Japan provided the air defense radar to the Philippine military, and more importantly, the information collected by this defense radar, air defense radar, would be shared between Japan and the Philippines. And accordingly, Japan and the Philippines are now negotiating on the GSOMIA, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, so that we can securely share the military information. So on bilateral basis, the Japan and the Philippines have now become equal security partner. And plus the trilateral among the Japan, the Philippines, and the United States has expanded over the past 2 years. We have conducted the first summit meeting among the 3 in April last year, and then we agreed to expand the trilateral cooperation. We have conducted lots of military exercises and trainings, and also we have expanded our Coast Guard cooperation among the 3 countries. And I would say the Japan, US, the Philippines trilateral has become the hub of the regional security partnerships. The trilateral relations has, the 3 countries have worked with the Australia, South Korea, and Canada. So I think this trilateral is now the basis of the regional cooperation. And plus the quadrilateral cooperation among Japan, United States, Philippines, and Australia is becoming very important. Some people call this quadrilateral squad instead of quad among Japan, US, Australia, India. And now the quad has become a non-traditional security agreement, but this squad has a potential to become the hub of the regional multilateral security cooperation. So, for example, the annual U.S.-Philippine bilateral exercise, the Barikatan, has now become a quadrilateral exercise. This year, Japan and Australia, for the first time, participated in this Barikatan exercise as a formal member of this exercise. And with lots of observers from Asia and the European countries. So this Barikatan exercise could become a very important multilateral exercise over the coming years. And again, this squad is the core of this regional potential regional cooperation. And also this squad countries have cooperated with other regional countries, including South Korea and Canada. And more importantly, the Coast Guard cooperation is now expanding based on this squad cooperation. I understand there will be a Coast Guard training and exercises near the Kyushu, the western part of Japan, recently. And also at the Shangri-La Dialogue, the 4 defense ministers from Squad conducted the second meeting, followed by the first one last year. And I think the joint statement issued by the 4 defense ministers was very important, and particularly the agreement on the expansion of ISR cooperation among the 4 militaries. So I would say this squad could become a very important scheme, not only to deal with the South China Sea issues, but also East China Sea issue and beyond. So let me throw out 2 important questions, which I don't have any answer. The first question is whether or not we should include Taiwan into this scheme, because currently the number 1 security concern in the East Asia is the possible Taiwan contingency. So without Taiwanese engagement, we just cannot maintain the peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, or even the East China Sea and the South China Sea. But because of the One China policy, it's very difficult to engage with Taiwan, particularly for military purposes. But without considering Taiwanese participation into the regional security mechanism, we just cannot preserve the peace and stability in the region. So why not we invite Taiwan as an observer to the Barikatan exercise next year, or the Remote Pacific exercise, the RIMPAC, next year, so that the regional militaries can engage with the Taiwanese counterpart. And the second question is how to consider the European participation in the Asian regional security issues. Over the past several years, European countries have dispatched the aircraft carriers, frigates, fighters, and other military platforms to the region for exercises and trainings. and the Asian partners welcomed the European willingness to work with working for the Asian security issues. But the Trump administration is not interested in the European pivot to Asia. So, for example, the Under Secretary for Defense, Bridge Corby, just recently stated to the German counterpart that Europe should stay in Europe. Europe should focus on the European affairs without allocating their limited resources between Europe and Asia. So we of course welcome the European willingness to work with Asian partners for Asian issues, but now that we have lots of issues in Europe and Middle East, so I think we should consider whether the Asians should deal with Asian issues and the Europeans should deal with European issues. So we will have a NATO summit meeting coming later this month, and I know the Japanese and the other Asian partners will join that summit meeting. But now I think it's time to discuss how to divide our roles in the global security issues. And I know in the next session, there will be some European participants, but hopefully we can discuss this issue in this panel and the next panel. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Tetsuo. Our next speaker will be Dianne Despi.
Thank you so much, CSIS, for having me here. I know that it's a little difficult to compete with everybody else's digestive systems, especially after lunch, but I will try my best. So I want to first lay down the fact that the Philippines has a unique and especially constrained strategic context, and not just because of state capacity. So its complex identity as an archipelago, a claimant state, a US ally, an economic partner to China, a member of the ASEAN, an approximate country to almost every important flashpoint in East Asia, shape its imperatives for national security and foreign policy, which makes strategic decision-making in our country extremely challenging. Moving to the topic at hand, my remarks will focus on 3 points. So first is the impact of the current situation on the South China Sea in the Philippines with respect to developments in domestic debates on national security. The second is the role of the Philippines in shaping the trajectory of the alliance network in terms of interests, partnerships, and activities. And lastly, what I think are the prospects and challenges for the Philippines in light of these shifting alliance network dynamics. So aside from the aggressive Chinese activities in the South China Sea, particularly in our EEZ, where these continue to endanger Filipinos and compromise good order at sea, the Philippines has been a target of China's increasing political coercion, economic pressure, and even cultural manipulation. China's multi-directional coercive activities in the Philippine domestic sphere seek to exploit the country's vulnerabilities, such as socio-economic inequality, fragmented governance, institutional weaknesses, and personalistic politics. This has actually helped us in fast-tracking shifts in strategic thought and decision-making, especially in realizing the value of self-reliance, defense modernization, and security cooperation. Discussions on foreign information manipulation and interference have permeated the national strategic community, and it highlights the need for quick and effective responses in identifying long-term reforms to increase national resilience against foreign malign interference. And although the Transparency Initiative has had mixed effects, especially operationally, two of its net gains, as was mentioned also in the earlier panel, were first to inform and involve our domestic audience regarding the developing situation, and second is to gather international support as the Philippine defense establishment resets itself from an internal security focus towards external defense. This leads me to my second point, where increasing support for the Philippines from the international community, particularly from the US and its allies in the region and even beyond, has sustained the uptick in cooperative activities in the realm of defense and security. Many observe a loosening of the bilateral alliance architecture in favor of more alternative arrangements that exemplify converging interests, such as the Squad. This has made way to an expansion in the scope and breadth of partnerships and operationalization to include meaningful bilateral and multilateral activities between and among US allies and partners. Although there has been a deepening of the US-Philippines alliance as of late, seen in the more substantial scope and scale of the Balikatan exercises, the agreed locations under the EDCA, or the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the signing of the GSOMIA, and further exploration of defense industrial cooperation, tensions and uncertainties in the global strategic environment and fractures in the US-led international order amplified the fact that the Philippines has been too reliant on the US for its external defense. And the need to pursue self-help measures and diversify its international partners has become more apparent. With a front row seat and a VIP pass to Chinese aggressive tactics on the ground, the Philippines is a site where ally interests converge, especially regarding multi-domain deterrence, maritime security and governance, and hybrid and cognitive warfare. The Philippines is especially doubling down and exploring these common interests with other US allies such as Japan, Australia, and even South Korea. Some of the people call these spoke-to-spoke, enhancing spoke-to-spoke relations, and other partners within the region and beyond, especially Europe. So other recent developments that reflect an expansion of the depth and breadth of partnerships include the signing of a status of forces agreement in New Zealand and the reciprocal access agreement with Japan, increased high-level and staff-to-staff engagement with European and Southeast Asian partners, and more dialogue on capability development, defense technology, and developing a defense industrial base. What is most important, though, is not just the symbolism of these agreements that we keep signing left and right, but it's actually more on the operationalization, implementation, and institutionalization of these agreements. So in terms of operationalizing these partnerships, we can see bilateral and multilateral exercises and joint patrols, what they call maritime cooperative activities, personal exchanges, and training activities that are designed to support our new acquisitions. We can expect more of these in the future. So for my last point, I just want to talk about the prospects and the challenges for the Philippines in the context of this evolving alliance network. So obviously there's a very high momentum for security cooperation between all US allies in the region. So the next few years will be a period of opportunity to develop, enhance, sustain, and institutionalize these partnerships and stretch beyond mill-to-mill cooperation. So some priorities for military cooperation include interoperability, crisis management, unified strategic communication, logistics support and sustainment, and unmanned systems development. But all of these can also extend towards stronger diplomatic and economic partnerships that both support capability development and also a more resilient and holistic partnership with these other countries. So this plays well on the Philippine perspective that security is comprehensive, and that is related also to our socio-economic domain. So for the Philippines, given the urgency of action and limited resources, prioritization and complementarity within the alliance network is key. So in the interest of filling gaps, avoiding redundancy, and eliminating the non-essential activities, more bilateral and multilateral dialogue, zeroing on specific needs, problems, and solutions available should be conducted. Collaborative strategic assessments and tabletop exercises, defense technology research, and joint concept development are also being pursued. From here, early warning systems and other alliance management mechanisms could be further developed. So the major challenge of the Philippines in this case is how to balance three of its most important interests, mainly maintaining strategic autonomy, reducing its domestic vulnerabilities so as to fully pursue its security interests and realize defense modernization, and third is contributing proactively to maintaining regional stability. This will entail a very massive reorientation of its national strategic community toward external defense, which has more focused on internal security for the longest time, and prioritizing national security perspectives in its strategic leadership, especially for the legislative branch, pursuing institutional development and reforms, and exploring what we look at as the economic security nexus in relation to securing critical infrastructure, developing policies supporting the private sector to build a strong domestic defense industrial base, and increasing the population's technological absorptive capacity. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dianne. Our next speaker will be Kathryn Paik.
Thanks, Kristi, and thanks to the CSIS organizers for this fantastic event. It's always great to speak here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the view from Australia, and then I'll turn it over to an actual Australian to correct me on everything I've said. So I think, first of all, we've had some really interesting developments within Australia over the last decade or so, and so I think it's important to take a moment and just appreciate the how much Australia's strategic outlook really has evolved over the last decade. And this has been not just in the way that Australia views the region, but also in how it views its role in the region. You can look at just through the lens of the strategic documents coming out of Canberra to really see this trajectory. Going back as far as Australia 2016, Australia's Defence White Paper did emphasize the importance of a stable Indo-Pacific region and a rules-based order, but didn't make any reference to any particular activity and certainly not any specific country. Only referenced the uncertainty due to US-China tension, and even noted that how Australia should be promoting Australian-Chinese defense relationship, which in today's context seems less than a decade later is pretty remarkable, I think. Fast forward a few years to Australia's 2020 Defense Strategic Update, you see this really demonstrated the shifting sentiment coming out of Canberra. It was much clearer articulation of Australia's responsibility and its agency to proactively shape the region. This update provided very pointed language on gray zone activities in the South China Sea and other coercive activities, although again did not specifically call out any specific country, although it did also very strongly promote the US-Australian alliance as a stabilizer. And then fast forward to 2023, the Defense Strategic Review much more explicitly calls out Chinese actions in the South China Sea, also presents, and this has been quite significant and easy to overlook, I think, from the outside, a real shift from what it called the Defense of Australia strategy to a doctrine to a national defense doctrine. And this new national defense doctrine really promoted and asserted that Australia must look and act much more outwardly in defense of its own national interests at home. So several factors prompted this shift, some of which I think you would be seen as very similar in the shift in strategic outlook from the Philippines, Japan, other countries, including the US as well. China's increasing ambitions, not just in the South China Sea, but across the Pacific Islands region, which Australia views as a strategically critical near region. China's influence and presence ramping up in that region has alarmed policymakers, not just in Canberra, but in Tokyo, Washington, Wellington, and beyond. Australia also experienced firsthand China's economic coercion when it ran afoul of Beijing on the international stage. And this experience only hardened the resolve coming out of Canberra, I would assert, and confirmed for Australian policymakers and a large proportion of the public that China's aims ran in very much counter ways to Australian national interests. So in response to this shifting perspective coming out of Canberra, we've seen really several things. I'll discuss sort of three buckets here. The first one is strengthening ties with ASEAN members and ASEAN as a whole. So in 2021, Australia, at the first Australia-ASEAN Special Summit, both sides decided to elevate the relationship to a comprehensive strategic partnership. The CSP, Australia was one of the first countries to do this with ASEAN. It was concluded in 2024. The Albanese government has really doubled down from his first term into the second on this relationship with ASEAN as a critically important piece of Australian foreign relations. And Albanese actually made his first trip of his second term, his first bilateral trip to Jakarta, and he did the same thing in his first term as well. Australia had its next Australian-ASEAN Special Summit in Melbourne in 2024. And at the same time, however, Australia has striven to really strengthen a lot of relationships bilaterally with ASEAN members, such as the Status of Forces Agreement with the Philippines, which it's had since 2012, but is much more active now, and also the Australia-Indonesia Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2024, another really significant move. The second piece here is that deepening ties with other external partners that are aligned with Australia's vision for the region. We've seen this certainly with Japan, as was already mentioned by my fellow panelists. Also with US and Tokyo and Wellington, not just on actions in the South China Sea, but also in the Pacific Islands, and collaborating much more closely on how we are all working together to fulfill some of the needs of the near region. But even beyond that, for example, Australia and the EU are currently exploring a security and defense partnership. And this would be a non-legally binding MOU to facilitate collaboration between Australia and the EU in defense industry, cybersecurity, critical technology, and counterterrorism. From the EU side, they've explained this as Europe having a very keen interest in maintaining peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. So again, very much in line. And just this past week, Prime Minister Albanese gave some really welcoming remarks at the G7 to Canada potentially joining track 2 of AUKUS. So that brings me to the third bucket here, which of course is work through multilateral fora. We've already discussed the Squad. The Quad is obviously another big piece of that. AUKUS, one of the, probably arguably the most significant security cooperation endeavor that the US and Australia and UK have taken on in the last several decades. Australia, Japan, US, trilateral work that they do across the region as well. Before closing, I'll just mention there's many challenges facing Australia's strategy looking forward in the region, but I'll mention 2 that I think are very front of mind for Australian policymakers at this very moment. One is resources, how to spread resources across a growing need, both in terms of what they need to be doing in the Pacific Islands, but also their own defense establishment. They've recently announced that they'll be going up to 2.3% defense spending of GDP in the next decade, and there's many that argue that that needs to go much higher, especially given AUKUS and many of their other defense requirements. The second piece here is uncertainty as to US commitment in the region. Australia is already having to calibrate perhaps some of its programming across the Pacific Islands and potentially looking at places that they need to do more economic engagement elsewhere as well. And also that uncertainty at home as to US commitment for things like AUKUS and the Quad and others. So those are 2 major factors that Australia is having to really factor in at the moment as policymakers look ahead. And I'll close there and turn it over.
Thank you, Kathryn. Our final speaker will be John Blaxland.
Dang, what a hard act to follow. I tell you what, geez Louise, you guys make it hard. And I'm at the end, so I'm going to try and jazz it up, try a different angle. Firstly, a point I want to make is that we're dealing with not just the South China Sea, right? My colleague Brendan Taylor, head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, talks about the 4 flashpoints. There's the Korean Peninsula, there's the East China Sea, there's the South China Sea, and there's Taiwan. But really, there's more than 4. They're just kind of 4 useful kind of points of reference. There's so many things going on. In fact, in a paper I wrote just last year called Adapting to Polycrisis, I said basically we've got a confluence of factors at play. We've got not just great power competition, we've got looming environmental catastrophe, we've got a spectrum of governance challenges, and all of that is accelerated by the 4th Industrial Revolution. And what could possibly go wrong? Well, of course, lots. In the mix is what I'm calling the Chinese Empire. Now, I don't mean to offend, and I don't mean to draw the comparisons too strictly, but I think there is a parallel between the emergence of the British Empire over 250 years. They started with the Industrial Revolution. They needed raw materials, they needed markets, they needed security for their raw materials and markets. They then needed governance for their security for their raw materials and markets. And before you knew it, you had an empire, right? But it took 250 years. It's been 25 since China joined the WTO, and it's gone from being a relative minnow to being globally dominant in trade in 25 years. 1/10 of the time that Britain took to build its empire. Now, things are different. It's not the same. It's not a closed system. But there are echoes there that are really interesting to think about the explosive economic growth of China and the power projection and aspirations that go with that are challenging the rest of us, if you like, right? And I think this goes to another point I'd like to, drawing from my unrestricted competition, my Adapting to Complexity paper, is this idea of unrestricted competition. And it riffs off this book by 2 Chinese colonels in the late 1990s called Unrestricted Warfare. Now, at the time, we wrote that off as being completely over the top, right? We're not at war with anybody. And of course, in English, we have a binary of war and peace. So this idea of unrestricted warfare, of legal, media, psychological, economic, and technical warfare just didn't make sense. Take out the word warfare, put in the word competition, and OMG. All of a sudden, look what you see. Click, 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 click. All of these things have been going on for ages. And we are in an unrestricted competition, I would say. Now, competition in and of itself is not a bad thing, right? We can cooperate on certain things, collaborate, compete, contest, and sometimes even confront, and hopefully avoid conflict. But I think there's a prism, if you like, for this cooperation, competition, conflict space that we're all in, right? We're all trying to duck and weave around crossing the red line, if you like, the kinetic threshold. We're trying to operate short of that, and we've got so much at stake. And we've got a world that is more connected than ever, more interdependent than ever, and more requiring of trust than ever, and yet it's less and less trust around, right? There's more and more distrust than we can poke a stick at. And in that mix, we've got what I'm calling the United States' transactional retreat from ideational leadership. And some are saying it's becoming more isolationist. I think there are some signs of that. I'm not sure that that's right, but it is generating some hedging, more hedging than we would have seen otherwise. We've seen the decline of USAID, the closing of Voice of America, and the decline, I would contend, in American soft power and its attractiveness globally. And yet, at the same time, I don't think we're seeing a commensurate increase in Chinese attractiveness because of its authoritarianism, its, the wolf warrior diplomacy of old, the rhetoric Dianne was talking about how the Philippines has kind of been treated lately. So there's some interesting dynamics at play. And in that mix, you've got Australia, which is, thank you, Kathryn, for articulating so well the points about Australia. My only caveat is Australia is kind of like a middle power with small power pretensions, right? We're reluctant to step up to the mark. We have you guys have Lewis and Clark, we have Burke and Wills, right? You know what happens to Burke and Wills? They die of thirst in the desert, right? So there's no glorious story about Australia's growth and empire. We're afraid of just surviving on the edge of the continent, right? So our view, many similarities with the United States, but some considerable significant differences, including that one. But this then gets us to ASEAN, and Kathryn touched on this, and ASEAN matters enormously for Australia. Some people call it the broken reed, right? Now, why bother with ASEAN? Completely ineffective body. Well, bollocks, I say to that, right? It's actually, imagine what the world is like without it. And, in international relations, we say correlation doesn't equal causation, right? But look at the correlation, it's amazing. At the world since ASEAN was formed, right? This poverty-struck, war-torn, malaria-infested backwater, has turned into where you only went with a rifle and camouflage, right? Now you go as a tourist or on business because it's where you want to be, right? This is a world that's transformed, okay, correlation, not causation, but it happens on ASEAN's watch, okay? And so this is one of the reasons why Australia is a huge believer in ASEAN. We're also a believer in all these other multilaterals because we like multilateral bodies. One of the ones that doesn't get a lot of Guernsey in Washington because it's not included is the Five Power Defence Arrangement, the FPDA, which is this interesting anachronism from the Cold War days when we were worried about Indonesia because we just had this confrontasi period with Indonesia. Sukarno had just lost office, so Suharto had come in, but we weren't quite sure how it was going to work out. The Malaysians and the Singaporeans were particularly nervous, and the Brits were leaving from east of Suez. Sort of started to come back, but that's another story. And so the Five Power Defence Arrangement set up to reassure Malaysia and Singapore, keep Malaysia and Singapore talking to each other nicely, and also keeping Australia and New Zealand and the UK engaged. So it's a win-win. In fact, even though it's anachronistic, it's still popular because those five countries still benefit. And now even Indonesia likes to play at least with a liaison capacity. So the Five Power Defence Arrangement, Indonesia, of course, for Australia is the critical one. It has got the heft in ASEAN. It's the most consequential nation in ASEAN. And of course, it's the country with which we have continued to play a game of snakes and ladders, right? Up the ladder we go, over incremental increases in improved relations, and then over beef, boat spies, clemency Timor, Papua Jerusalem, down the snake we go. And before you know it, we're trying to reconstruct relations with Indonesia because of the considerable differences culturally between our countries and economically. We're kind of competitors, not really complementary economically. So nonetheless, though, in the last 10 years, we've seen incredible closeness emerge through the security, economic, trade, intelligence, and educational fronts. So the relationship now, we've seen Prabowo, the Australian Prime Minister, first port of call, goes to meet Pak Prabowo, really important, because Indonesia matters to Australia, it matters to ASEAN, ASEAN matters to Australia, that's critical. In addition, is the other one we don't talk about, but this is the one that looks at what happens in the South China Sea, really interested to know how UNCLOS goes because of the implications in the South Pacific and East Pacific, right, or West Pacific, right? Because these micro-states that are not terribly well governed, with limited resources in and of themselves, are subject to those competitions I talked about at the start. Great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And they're all looking around, particularly the Pacific Island Forum nations. They need help, and they are seeing this competition, they are seeing this looming environmental catastrophe, and they're looking out for a hand. And Australia is trying to play a better role. I think there was a significant role played by the United States. USAID retractions and etc. are generating, in my view, significant blowback. And of course, there's a question about what do we do? In the mix is France. The France-Australia-New Zealand agreement, who would have thunk? France is in the Pacific, we forget this, but it's a consequential player. And of course, Canada is in there too. And Canada, it's a NATO country. Who else is in NATO? Why is NATO playing? Now, we touched on this before. NATO actually has a bit of buy-in in the Pacific. I mean, apart from the fact that the Americans are NATO members, Canada's a NATO member, and Britain is a NATO member, and it plays a little bit with FPDA, I mentioned. But Canada is actually trying to play more in the Pacific. It's had an Indo-Pacific strategy for a number of years. Of course, it's got limitations like the Australian Defence Force. It's a boutique defence force structured for the unipolar moment. That moment is well and truly past. I think Canada, like Australia, need to do a bit of muscling up. But there we have it. We've got a lot of dimensions of multipolarity, of interconnectedness, and a spectrum of challenges we face that actually require us to think collaboratively. While we're playing competitively, while we're confronting, while we're challenging, and while we're trying to avoid cross the threshold, the kinetic threshold. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of our speakers for those initial remarks. Just to highlight some of the themes that I think came out, each of you spoke in various ways about the interplay of domestic and external factors with countries both becoming more aware of externally intensifying threats and being more aware of the need to engage, but at the same time just dealing with persistent domestic constraints in various ways and considering how to balance those. I think we also heard some interesting reflections on the evolving institutional architecture of the region and its general trend towards multilateralization from the bilateral structures, but also some concerns about how we move from the stage of agreements to deepening and operationalizing those relationships. And interesting comments about how this architecture is clearly not only designed to deal with problems in the South China Sea, but also for other regional problems, other flashpoints, other concerns. And of course, many echoes of the same themes about questions among U.S. allies about changing U.S. foreign policy and how to rebalance relationships, and if indeed there is a need to consider prioritizing or dividing efforts in the midst of this changing environment. So we have about 15 minutes left for questions, so we'll open it up to the audience. Would you please raise your hand if you have a question, and when the microphone comes to you, we'd appreciate it if you could please stand and state your name and institutional affiliation.
So, Chu Ping-hu from East Asian International Relations Caucus. I want to thank Kotani-san for raising about the Taiwan question. So, in fact, during the ASEAN Regional Forum this year in Kuala Lumpur, the Southeast Asian countries actually expressed our concerns about the Taiwan Strait scenario. So, of which, of course, the China delegation answer with the three 三中原则, so one China principle and such and such. So, however, this also means that finally it has come to the surface of the situation where Southeast Asians who used to be very paranoid about discussing about Taiwan started to pay attention. So to that, I want to ask, what is Japan's official security assistance strategy? So what would be the next phase of implementation? And to Dianne, about the feasibility of inviting Taiwan, as Kotani Sensei mentioned, to Balagatan exercise. And I also noticed that Philippine Navy is also investing a lot in strengthening your shipbuilding capacity and such. So would that be something that for a regional defense industrial cooperation might be in the book for Philippines to consider? And of course, to US and Australia, what would be the ideal approach to push for better coalitional cooperation outside of the alliance framework in trying to perhaps link or not linking the Taiwan Strait and also the South China Sea scenario? Thank you so much.
So we have several questions to panelists there. Perhaps we could start with Tetsuo on the question of official security assistance.
Well, thanks very much. And before answering the question, because of my jet lag, I forgot to mention the very important part of my initial presentation. So give me 30 minutes.
Well, 30.
Well, the Japanese Ministry of Defense is now try to promote the concept of one theater. As John mentioned, there are 4 flashpoints in East Asia, but rather than treating these 4 flashpoints as separate issues, this one theater concept is advocating treating these 4 issues as one big challenge, so that we can respond collectively. And hopefully this one theater concept, I mean, this concept is still in a primitive stage and still developing, but hopefully this one theater concept could provide a further regional partnership cooperation. And regarding the Japanese strategy for providing the official security assistance to the region, now Japan is discussing with Malaysia and Indonesia on the provision of patrol boats. And I understand the Japanese government is trying to expand this scheme so that we can provide more defensive weapons, defensive equipments to the regional militaries. Because our ODA scheme does not allow us to provide the defensive equipment to the regional partners. We established this official security partnership. And the budget for this scheme is now expanding every year. So hopefully we can provide more equipments to the regional partners. And on Taiwan question, because of the one China policy of Japan, we are very much, how can I say, cautious to establish any defense relationship with Taiwan. But at least the China's exercises surrounding Taiwan could pose a threat to the Japanese interest and other regional partners. I think it justifies us to seek more engagement with the Taiwanese counterparts.
Thank you for that question in Taiwan. So I learned that it's never good to close all doors, but it's also good to be very cautious about things. And we don't want to get dragged anywhere we don't want to be, so I will leave it at that. But for the shipbuilding capacity in relation to regional defense industrial cooperation, I'd like to focus on that more because shipbuilding and ship repair is something that the Philippines has been looking at for quite a long time, probably starting the 2010s. And it's very much related to the Philippine interests of trying to improve its maritime domain awareness and at the same time also trying to strengthen maritime governance and also in relation to building a stronger relationship with the private sector, especially to reduce costs when it comes to shipbuilding and ship repair. Thank you.
And maybe I'll take just a couple quick thoughts on this one, and then to John also. For the Australia, how Australia and US might be thinking about South China Sea, Taiwan, outside of the alliance. I think you point to an important point that, as was already mentioned, these are all interconnected, of course, right? It's something that affects Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait stability will certainly spill over and vice versa. And I think both US and Australia within the alliance context look at it that way, but I think it's also very important and has been under work for quite some time to increase that discussion between US Japan, Australia, for example, other major players ensuring that there's alignment not just in messaging and in engagement with Taiwan, but also in deterrence and how we're looking at this more broadly throughout the region. I think you could look at AUKUS, you could look at a lot of other major initiatives that the U.S. and others have taken on together, and those meet some of the deterrence needs, not just for one specific event, but for the entire thing.
Great, and thank you. Yeah, so the Australian position is very much that we want to maintain the status quo. We don't want to see a change. And so we are all for reducing prospects of adventurism and increasing prospects of stability. And part of that is getting ASEAN to speak with more of a single voice, to have a bit of solidarity. And there, of course, in that space, you've got a lot of views, and IR theorists like to talk about balancing hedging and bandwagoning, and there's lots of theorising about how much the states in ASEAN are doing that. And in my view, in my limited insights on Southeast Asia, is that all of them like to hedge. All of them, to some degree or another, they like to have a bob each way. They want the Goldilocks solution, right? They want as much trade as they can with China, and they want as much security as they can from the United States and like-mindeds. Thanks.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, please.
My name is Mark from United Daily News. We're based in Taiwan, so not to bombard the panelists with the question of Taiwan, but just happened to be that way. Okay, my question is, I believe it was during the 2010s, I think Taiwan was labeled as one of the major players in the South China Sea, but now it plays a much less significant role. I'm just wondering why is that, and also how can Taiwan play a more important role in the future, and how could a Taiwan contingency impact the South China Sea? Thank you.
Do any of our speakers want to tackle that question on the role of Taiwan?
Well, I'll have a go. Look, the thing is, war gamers like to think about how things might unfold. And one of the scenarios out there is that a clash in the South China Sea is partly a kind of precursor to a bigger stoush or, choking of Taiwan. And the example of what's been happening about Second Thomas Shoal is sometimes cited as kind of a mini example of what you might be able to do around Taiwan. So you can't really tease out one from the other. Taiwan and South China Sea, I mean, they're right there. Taiwan is a claimant. In fact, it's very interesting to think about how many islands are actually claimed by Taiwan and occupied by Taiwan. I mean, of course, like the PRC, it claims them all. But it actually occupies a surprising number as well. So that's a significant factor. And teasing this all apart is devilishly difficult because they're all on top of each other. Vietnam, PRC, Taiwan, they're all in the mix, the Philippines as well. So, but linked intimately.
Next question. Let's go back there.
Yeah, my question is, when we talk about alliance, the most important alliance for Australia is AUKUS. And right now we know the AUKUS is under review by Trump administration. And we know that when the destination for Australia's future nuclear submarines main patrol area is South China Sea to counter Chinese Navy. So I want to know what's Australia's contingency plan if, let's say, AUKUS was delayed or cancelled?
Do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I can have a go. So AUKUS is not an alliance, it's a security partnership. So that it shouldn't be conflated with the US-Australia alliance, which I don't think there's any review or question of that. There is the review going on for AUKUS. There was a review in the UK, and Australia also conducted their own review on this past year. So, just putting that all in context as well. And I think in terms of a plan B, again, AUKUS is just one piece of a much broader interconnected defense systems between Australia and the US. We've had deep defense partnerships for years, and those continue to accelerate. And I think we'll continue to see those accelerate, even if AUKUS is adjusted or changed in some way. I wouldn't see that as needing an actual plan B that diverges from that US-Australia alliance in that way.
I would just add that Australia's, since Federation, has always wanted to have subs, and for most of it has had subs. And when it hasn't had subs, it's had allied subs operating from Australia. So that's because we're a maritime, we're an island nation. We're mostly, we live on, people say we're girt by beach, we're girt by sea, we live around the coast. We're very much a maritime trading nation. Submarines are part of the mix. And yes, they can reach the South China Sea. Look, our submarines have been able to reach the South China Sea for about 70 years, actually. But the thing is, in fact, if you want to be able to defend your own exclusive economic zone, to get from Perth to any other port takes about 12 snorts. The only way to do that undetected is to stay underwater. And that's because with low Earth satellite, almost saturation low Earth satellite, pattern analysis over 30 years, coupled with artificial intelligence and drones, you can't hide if you come to recharge your batteries. The wake of the snorkel is detectable. So the only solution is to stay underwater, and the only way to do that is nuclear propulsion for long distances. Now, other countries can operate submarines with much shorter distances and not worry about it. Australia doesn't have that option. It's simply not an option. You can't go undetected anywhere from Perth. So yes, you can go to the South China Sea, but it's actually every country, a maritime trading nation like Australia, has the right to protect its own resources and its capabilities. And the only real way to do that nowadays is with a nuclear propulsion submarine, and this is the best deal around, so we're really keen to make it work. Thanks.
So our time for this panel is unfortunately drawing to a close, but I think we've set the scene for a very interesting conversation about the role of other actors in the South China Sea for the next panel. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers for their comments.